From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
All of the victims were brushed aside in every part of the state by church leaders who preferred to protect the abusers and their institutions above all. Priests were raping little boys and girls, and the men of God who were responsible for them not only did nothing, they hid it all for decades.
A shocking new grand jury report in Pennsylvania has revealed more than 300 Catholic priests there sexually abused 1,000 children and possibly thousands more over 7 decades. But will anyone be held accountable? We'll speak with a survivor of the sexual abuse, as well as a former priest, a whistleblower. Then we go to Detroit to speak with Rashida Tlaib, who's poised to become the first Palestinian-American woman and first Muslim woman to serve in Congress. She's a democratic socialist who supports the Palestinian right of return and a one-state solution. Last year, she was forcibly removed from a Trump rally in Detroit after she heckled the president.
Home ownership is at its lowest rate in 51 years.
Rashida Tlaib shouted, "Read the Constitution," as she was taken out by security. She'll join us from her home city of Detroit. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Afghanistan, funerals have begun for 37 people killed after a suicide bomber struck an education center Wednesday in the capital, Kabul. Most of the dead were young women and men who were preparing for university entrance exams. The bombing was followed by an assault on an Afghan intelligence service based in Kabul by gunmen firing rocket-propelled grenades earlier today. Meanwhile, Taliban fighters overran a military outpost in Afghanistan's northern Baghlan province, killing 44 soldiers and police officers. Elsewhere, U.S.-backed Afghan forces claim to have taken control of most of the city of Ghazni on Wednesday, following some of the heaviest fighting Afghanistan has seen in years. The UN estimates 150 civilians died during the 5-day campaign, and local hospitals report they're overwhelmed with the injured and the dead. This is Omid, a resident of Ghazni.
It has been almost 4 days of insurgents in the city, but the government has not paid attention to the people here, and as you can see, most of the markets have burnt down in the city.
The violence came as the Taliban said it would no longer grant safe passage to workers, with the International Committee of the Red Cross accusing the agency of failing to support Taliban prisoners held by the U.S.-backed government in Kabul. Donald Trump has revoked the security clearance of his staunch political opponent, former CIA Director John Brennan, who's repeatedly called Trump unfit to be president. Brennan served as CIA Director under President Obama, where he oversaw the agency's drone assassination program. Ben Wasner of the ACLU said in response to Brennan's loss of clearance, "We have been unsparing in our criticism of John Brennan's defense of the CIA torture program and his role in unlawful lethal strikes abroad. But Trump's revocation of Brennan's clearance and his threats to revoke the clearances of other former officials for the sole reason they've criticized his conduct and policies amount to unconstitutional retaliation," the ACLU said. At the White House, Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders said other former executive branch officials who've been critical of Trump could be next.
James Clapper, James Comey, Michael Hayden, Sally Yates, Susan Rice, Andrew McCabe, Peter Strzok, Lisa Page, and Bruce Orr. Security clearances for those who still have them may be revoked, and those who have already lost their security clearance may not be able to have it reinstated.
Among former administration officials whose security clearance Trump isn't reviewing, Michael Flynn, Trump's former national security advisor, who pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI over his conversations with Russian officials. This all comes as a jury is deliberating over the fate of Trump's former campaign chair, Paul Manafort, who faces 18 charges related to special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation, including tax fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering. And it comes after former White House aide Omaroso Manigault Newman, said Trump was recorded repeatedly using the N-word and shared a recording of a White House official discussing potential fallout from Trump's use of the racist slur. Meanwhile, Trump's legal team said Wednesday it may fight all the way to the Supreme Court to quash a possible subpoena from Robert Mueller for an interview with the president. Trump has so far refused to be questioned by Mueller, yet his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is saying Mueller should submit his report before September 7th, threatening, quote, if he doesn't get it done in the next 2 or 3 weeks, we will just unload on him like a ton of bricks. More than 300 newspapers and media outlets have launched a campaign today to counter President Trump's attacks on the free press. The effort is led by the Boston Globe, which wrote in an editorial today, for more than 2 centuries, this foundational American principle has protected journalists at home and served as a model for free nations abroad. Today, it's under serious threat, and it sends an alarming signal to despots from Ankara to Moscow, Beijing to Baghdad, that journalists can be treated as a domestic enemy. Unquote. In Turkey, a court has released the honorary chair of Amnesty International Turkey, Taner Kilic, more than a year after he was arrested along with other human rights campaigners for allegedly supporting a failed 2016 coup attempt. Kilic's arrest drew international condemnation over Turkey's increasingly harsh crackdown on human rights. This is Taner Kilic speaking just after his release.
Umarım adalet herkes için gerçekleşir.
I hope justice will prevail for everyone. I hope the independent and impartial judiciary will serve for everyone. I am not the one in the worst situation. There are people in a worse situation than I am. I hope there will be a fair trial for everyone.
Kilic's release came amidst an escalating trade war between Washington and Ankara, and after the Trump administration brought sanctions against Turkey, demanding the release of an American missionary named Andrew Brunson, who was one of thousands of people detained in Turkey after the failed coup of 2016. In Brazil, jailed former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva has formally registered as the Workers' Party candidate for president, even as Brazil's electoral court threatens to invalidate his candidacy. Lula is currently in jail, serving a 12-year sentence on a corruption conviction his party says was politically motivated. Polls show him as front-running candidate for the October presidential elections. On Wednesday, 10,000 of Lula's supporters marched through the streets of the capital, Brasilia, among them former President Dilma Rousseff and current vice presidential candidate Fernando Haddad.
Today we won with our strength, our conviction, and with the certainty that Lula is innocent.
We know about the framing of Lula. We know that the trial, which from the start looked to take Lula out of the presidential campaign, is a sham trial. A trial in which no crime was proved, much less a single shred of evidence against President Lula.
In the Mediterranean, an aid ship carrying 141 migrants rescued off the coast of Libya docked in Malta Wednesday, capping an ordeal that saw European Union member countries deny the migrants a safe harbor for 5 days. The migrants are mostly Eritreans and Somalis, dozens of them children. Doctors Without Borders, which helps operate the rescue ship Aquarius, said many of the migrants fell victim to sexual violence and slave labor in Libya. Last month, President Trump praised Italy's newly elected Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte for denying harbor to the rescue ship Aquarius as it approached Italy with 629 migrants aboard. In Massachusetts, the ACLU says it's uncovered emails showing how a pair of federal immigration agencies work together to trap and arrest immigrants as they arrive for interviews to seek permanent residency. The ACLU says ICE agents coordinated its efforts with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services as immigrants arrive with their spouses who are U.S. citizens at citizenship offices throughout New England seeking green cards. The agencies reportedly scheduled the arrests at times that would attract less public attention. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says a record 72,000 Americans died of drug overdose deaths last year as the opioid epidemic reached new heights. 2017's death toll from overdoses increased by about 10% from a year earlier. It surpassed the number who died from car crashes, gun violence, and HIV/AIDS combined. 2 Senate Democrats up for re-election in states Trump won in 2016 met with federal Judge Brett Kavanaugh Wednesday, further dimming the prospects of opponents of Trump's far-right Supreme Court nominee. The meetings by Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota and Senator Joe Donnelly of Indiana come ahead of Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing scheduled for September 4th. This comes as some Democrats blasted the process for Kavanaugh's review. Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey tweeted on Wednesday, quote, Chairman Grassley has unilaterally ruled 1/3 of Kavanaugh records to be committee confidential, meaning anyone not on Judiciary Committee cannot see them. That's 79 senators and the entire American public. It's an unprecedented level of secrecy. Hashtag, what are they hiding? Senator Markey tweeted. The Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, known as PREPA, said Wednesday it's finished restoring electricity across the island more than 11 months after Hurricane Maria destroyed most of Puerto Rico's electrical grid. Critics warn the grid remains highly vulnerable to future storms as the peak of the hurricane season approaches, and there are a number of Puerto Ricans who say their electricity has not been restored. And the Puerto Rico Federation of Teachers marched Wednesday through the streets of Old San Juan, holding a one-day strike as the fall school semester began amidst budget cuts imposed by a federally appointed fiscal control board. Teachers are demanding a reconsideration of the closing of more than 250 public schools, an increase in teacher salary, and no more privatizations of public schools. This is striking teacher Noelani Fuentes Cardena.
They eliminate a budget, but nonetheless, in the executive and administrative positions, millions and thousands of dollars are wasted on salaries. But in the classroom, nothing is invested like it should. So we have the contradiction of closing job placements but hiring in other executive positions and distributing money in places that are not necessary. If there are budget cuts, they need to redistribute the small amount of money, or lack of, into the real necessities of the Department of Education. More teachers, facility structures, and materials for our students. If they speak and say that our children are first, let's take that word into action. Let's demonstrate if children are really first or if their pocket is first.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nareen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. In Pennsylvania, a new grand jury report has revealed how more than 300 Catholic priests sexually abused 1,000 children and possibly thousands more over 7 decades, and that the church leadership covered up the abuse. On Tuesday, Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro described some of the report's findings.
In the Diocese of Pittsburgh, the grand jury named 99 priests who sexually abused children. A group of at least 4 predator priests in Pittsburgh groomed and violently sexually assaulted young boys. One boy was forced to stand on a bed in a rectory, stripped naked, and pose as Christ on the cross for the priests. They took photos of their victim, adding them to a collection of child pornography which they produced and shared on church grounds. To make it easier to target their victims, the priests gave their favored boys gifts, gold crosses to wear as necklaces. The crosses were markings of which boys had been groomed for abuse.
The Pennsylvania report details how priests raped young girls and boys, including one priest who raped a young girl in the hospital after she had her tonsils out. Another priest impregnated a young girl, then arranged for her to have an abortion.
The report also reveals how the church orchestrated a massive, systematic cover-up to conceal the abuse, including lying to the community about why a priest was removed from a parish, transferring pedophile priests rather than firing them, and locking abuse complaints away in what the church called a, quote, secret archive. This is Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro.
All of the victims were brushed aside in every part of the state by church leaders who preferred to protect the abusers and their institutions above all. Priests were raping little boys and girls, and the men of God who were responsible for them not only did nothing, they hid it all for decades. Monsignors, auxiliary bishops, bishops, archbishops, cardinals have mostly been protected. Many, including some named in this report, have been promoted. Father Schlert, identified in the report, is now Bishop Schlert. Bishop Wuerl is now Cardinal Wuerl. Father Zubik is now Bishop Zubik. Predator priests were allowed to remain in ministry for 10, 20, even 40 years after church leaders learned of their crimes. In those years, their lists of victims got longer and longer.
While charges have been filed against 2 priests in Pennsylvania, the report states the statute of limitations has expired on almost all of the offenses. On Wednesday, the Center for Constitutional Rights and the Survivors Network of those abused by priests, known as SNAP, sent a letter to the Justice Department demanding a federal investigation into church abuse. Pressure is also growing on Pope Francis to respond as church sex abuse scandals continue to grow across the globe.
In a moment, we'll be joined by 2 guests, a survivor of sexual abuse by a Pennsylvania priest and a former Catholic priest who now helps survivors. But first, I'd like to turn to a video produced by the Office of the Pennsylvania Attorney General, featuring the voices of several survivors of church abuse.
My name is Robert Corby, and I'm 83 years old.
Sean Doherty, 48 years old.
Carolyn Fortney, 37.
I grew up in a small western Pennsylvania town, Johnstown, Pennsylvania.
I grew up in Bethlehem.
Anhot, which is like right behind Steel High School, Steelton area.
I was groomed starting young.
The day I met him, I was around 18 months old.
They targeted me because I was fatherless.
I was in my diaper, and I ran out and ran right to him.
We were taught, I mean, the priests and the nuns are God.
Just think, like, the word God makes me think of him, and I just...
You're being groomed to get used to a grown man's hands, you know, on you regularly.
So he would always have his hands on me.
When you have the priest touching you every day, you know, that's a hard memory to have. The first thought of an erection that you have in your life is by the hands of the priest.
All of a sudden, he was gone.
Father Karchik in my 8th grade year was just up and moved with no notice, no anything. The town was devastated. Everybody loved him.
They haven't found out yet.
He abused it, and the church covered it up.
Who would have believed me? A priest in 1948 or 47 would abuse you? Or do that? Never heard of such a thing because they covered it up.
It doesn't ever go away. It has an effect on you for the rest of your life.
And I'm a survivor.
This is not a vendetta against the church. We're called survivors for a reason.
These are people that these priests ruined their lives, and they still, at 83 years old, still affects them.
I just feel like my whole life has been a lie.
Has absolutely destroyed me.
My children suffered. My wife suffered.
My dad found out, but he went crazy.
I was very unaffectionate. I couldn't show any affection with my wife.
I had no desire to have children. None, because of this.
My children I couldn't hold or hug.
I didn't feel comfortable at all. I still don't feel comfortable now in relationships.
No kids for me.
The affection I could give to her. And thanks to Father Royer, he took that away from me.
I mean, it's affected my life so much.
This is a lifelong issue with survivors.
They have to be accountable, the church, for what they did.
I've waited for a long time for this.
I think this report's going to help people who don't have a family, because they're going to know that there's a lot of people out there now that believe them and are behind them.
This is one of the proudest things I've ever done in my life.
I'm so happy.
Speaking about your abuse is a very important step in the healing process.
I just was always saying, They're not going to beat me.
It'll just be refreshing to not have to, I guess, pretend like I'm someone else all the time. It's very lonely, especially when it's your word against God's.
Voices of victims of sexual abuse in Pennsylvania. When we come back, we'll be joined by one of those victims, Sean Doherty, as well as a whistleblowing priest, Bob Hodson. Stay with us.
Thank you for hearing me. 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 Thank you for loving 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 me. Thank you for seeing 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 me. And for not leaving.
Thank you for hearing me by Sinead O'Connor. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We're continuing to look at the shocking new Pennsylvania grand jury report that has revealed how more than 300 Catholic priests sexually abused 1,000 children and possibly thousands more over 7 decades, and that the church leadership covered up the abuse. We're joined now by two guests.
Sean Doherty is with us. He was molested by a priest from Altoona-Johnstown Diocese in Pennsylvania for 3 years, starting when he was 10 years old. The priest responsible, George Kocharczyk, has been defrocked, even though the FBI determined he was a child predator. The priest cannot be tried as such because of expired statute of limitations. Sean Doherty's story was one of many included in the grand jury report released on Tuesday. Bob Hodson is also with us, a former Catholic priest, co-founder and president of Road to Recovery, which assists victims of sexual abuse. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Sean, we saw you in the clip released by the Pennsylvania Attorney General. Talk about what happened to you, how old you were, and when you blew the whistle or told anyone.
Beginning in 5th grade, my priest, my religion teacher, my peewee basketball coach was Father George Kocharczyk, a well-loved young priest in our community who had been grooming me for years of getting used to him handling me physically, touching me, having him close to me. And in the 5th grade, that touching progressed to sexual assault. George Kocharczyk, to this day, I believe he must have, my belief is that he has a personal infatuation with male genitalia. I believe from the patterns and the things that he did throughout the 3 years, I believe he was testing us to see, he wanted to know the exact day that we were going to be sexually mature, in my opinion. And that progressed to one-time digital penetration in a shower when I was 13. I did not like that experience at all, and I gave him a look in the shower, and surprisingly, it ended for me that day in the shower. Unfortunately, for some of my friends, it continued for them.
Do you know how many people were involved? How many children?
He admitted to the Altoona Johnstown grand jury to being close to 12 boys. I imagine it's a much bigger number than that.
And when did he admit this?
The report was released in March of 2016 by then Attorney General Kathleen Kane of Pennsylvania. And on pages 66 and 67 of that, my name is a redacted name. And at some point over the course of that grand jury investigation lead up to that rollout, he admitted to that. And it's in the report.
What did the church know of what he was doing? He not only groomed
Here's the fun part.
he groomed your parents as well, going bowling with them.
Not just mine. Not just my parents. He groomed the entire community. Since becoming public, after the report came out, reading that, I just said, I can't stay silent. Well, what drew me out was a newspaper article with him on the front page. 2 people had gone to the Bishop of Altoona Johnstown Diocese in 2012 to call him out.
6 years ago.
Those 2 same brothers went to the then Monsignor in 1983 about Father Koharchik in my 8th grade year. Reported
Decades
it,
ago.
confirmed it. Monsignor went then to Bishop Hogan, covered it up, and this is firsthand experience by one of the brothers. I grew up with these guys,
Bishop
and now
Hogan,
I know
the
Bishop
Bishop
Hogan,
of
Altoona Johnstown, years ago, made an arrangement, a financial. We need to protect the church. We need to protect the reputation. We need to protect your kids. We need to keep it quiet. And they agreed to transfer him. It took them 6 months. They didn't tell anybody. They permitted. I grew up a block from the school. It was in my 8th grade year. They didn't tell anybody. They allowed me and 3 of my friends in the rectory, in his private space, to pack his belongings. The entire top shelf of his book was all medical journals on male genitalia, right? We got in the car, drove to Portage, Pennsylvania, to the new school and to the new rectory that he was assigned to, and we spent the night in the rectory. And he had just been transferred for sexually abusing 2 boys.
What happens when a priest is caught, embezzling?
They're in jail. Immediately. You can't steal from the church. The church steals from you. It's not a two-way street. That is not a two-way street with the church. Money flows one direction.
Yet
and
when
if
a
you
priest
take it from them,
steals the life of a child, the dignity of a child, the church
part
protects.
of me feels that there is I mean, I can't say, Bob could probably speak more to this when he comes on, is that I have to say that there has to be a part of the church that feels that is their benevolent right of some kind. I really just, it's starting to seem like there is a percentage of the church that feels like it is their divine right to do this. It is so systemically huge.
You mentioned earlier, and forgive me for asking, what exactly digital penetration is?
He stuck his finger in my anus in the shower when I was 13 years old. I believe he was testing to see if I would go further.
Could you talk about also the issue of the statute of limitations and what that means for survivors like yourself?
When I was a child and I was faced with this, my statutes of limitation only permitted me to talk and press charges until I was 15 years old. I had 2 years past the end of the last assault. So I was not legally old enough to drive a car in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, yet I had to come forward and tell my parents and the community that the guy that they bull with every Thursday night is raping the kids.
Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro emphasized how the Catholic Church delayed taking action on reports of priests engaged in child sexual abuse in order to prevent criminal charges from being filed.
The pattern was abuse, deny, and cover up. The effect not only victimized children, it served a legal purpose that church officials manipulated for their advantage. The longer they covered it up, the less chance law enforcement could prosecute these predators because the statute of limitations would run. As a direct consequence of the systematic cover-up by senior church officials, Almost every instance of child sexual abuse we found is too old to be prosecuted.
That's Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro. I want to bring a former priest into this conversation. That's right, Bob Hotzen, former Catholic priest, president of Road to Recovery. Talk about being in the church when you were a priest and blowing the whistle.
Well, I was 40 years an insider in this church. I was 23 years in the religious life and 14 as a priest. So I saw it from the inside. I was sexually abused by 3 different men in the religious life, and I knew what was going on the inside, and it was just abject corruption from the get-go. This church is a criminal enterprise that actually covers up the massive sexual abuse of children for centuries.
Well, Bob, could you respond to what Sean said earlier? I mean, you were sexually abused by 3 different men. They were all priests. Is that correct?
They were religious brothers, actually.
And what does that mean?
A religious brother is someone who lives in community, but it does not have the ability to say Mass, etc. They do more social kinds of works, like education, hospital work, etc.
And what happened to you?
Well, the day I stepped into the religious life at the age of 18, after having graduated from high school as the top senior of my class, this person said to me, this superior said to me, "Bob, you're a cold person. I'm going to have to warm you up." He continued that mantra on for the entire year until the second superior I had in the novitiate, which is the most important year of formation because that's where you learn the spiritual life. Well, that superior sexually abused me. And then when I reported it to another superior, he told me that, yes, I was preyed upon. But that night he crept into bed and sexually assaulted me in the same way that I had described to him several hours previously.
So do you agree with what Sean suggested, that part of the church is their belief that they have some kind of benevolent right?
Oh, absolutely. What this is a massive abuse of power. And then it's exhibited in the sexual abuse of not just children, but teenagers and vulnerable adults as well. And it's also part of the reason why financial crimes are committed within the church. So every aspect of dysfunction is exhibited because of the abuse of power.
So talk about when you came forward in a big way. It wasn't actually when you were being sexually abused, though you were repeatedly.
Yes. In 2003, I testified before the New York State Legislature, and I was a priest at the time. I was directing 2 schools in the inner city of Newark, and I called for the resignation of any bishop in the United States who has covered up child sexual abuse. 3 days later, I was called into the chancery of the Newark Archdiocese and fired by my bishop for speaking out.
And they said explicitly to you that you're being fired because you spoke out?
Oh, yes. I was told that my language was too volatile at the hearing in Albany, and the bishop asked me to tone down my language. And then they slid a letter across the table at me, and it said that you're fired, effective immediately. Now, they didn't take away my priestly faculties then. But in 2005, when I turned around and sued him for doing all of these retaliatory things, then they put me on complete suspension, and I wasn't able to function as a priest at all.
Now, you blew the whistle at a Catholic high school. Explain. This wasn't when you were being abused,
right.
But you felt that principle?
Well, having been abused as a child and also as a teenager, my antenna, has been up for a very long time. So in 1981, when I was stationed at a high school in Boston, Catholic Memorial High School, the chaplain of the school used to go into the athletic locker room with a camera. He would go into the shower room. So I saw this. I went immediately to the headmaster and I said, this has to stop. He has to be out of here. Well, he happened to be the 3rd highest ranking member of the Archdiocese of Boston at the time. He was the vice chancellor. His name was Fred Ryan. And Monsignor Fred Ryan was sexually abusing, I thought, 2 kids in particular. I went to the headmaster. I told him. The headmaster said, oh, no, he's a wonderful priest. We're not going to do anything about this. 20 years later, those 2 young men went public with their abuse. And that's really what started Road to Recovery, because I went back to Boston every week from then on to help them in their recovery. And I apologized profusely to them for not screaming more loudly in 1981.
Sean, could you elaborate on the point that Bob made? I mean, on the one hand, the scale of this grand jury report, I mean, 1,000 survivors of sexual abuse, over 300 priests implicated, and yet, obviously, there has been a massive cover-up. Could you say who you think, how many people have been responsible for that cover-up, how many people are complicit, and what you think should happen?
There's really no current way to tell how many people are involved in the cover-up. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church is a massive organization that has many hands and fingers that are willing to help. It's not hard. It hasn't been hard for them to find an enabling ear to bend. So that they are having a lot of help. What should happen as a result of this? These are crimes. Massive amounts of crimes have been committed, and crime deserves a punishment. Use a little of the Catholic tough love with the Catholic Church. The legislative end of this in Pennsylvania, I have been to the Capitol regularly for the last 2.5 years since becoming public to pass very common sense legislation that Representative Mark Rozzi of Berks County, also a rape victim of the church. He was raped in a shower at 13, which is why he's a representative, and he's pushing for this legislation. The Republican-controlled Senate in Pennsylvania that is dominated by lobbyists from the Insurance Federation, from the Catholic Conference, will not let it go.
What is the Insurance Federation?
The insurance agents don't want this law to go through either because they're the ones that are going to be set foot in the bill. The church only does it. They don't pay for it.
And explain what the Catholic Conference is.
The Catholic Conference is a conference of bishops in the country that get together, even though each individual diocese is run individually by each individual bishop. They only have that control of their diocese. They do meet, and on certain aspects of the religion and activities, I believe they come to a common consensus. They argue. I think it's just like our political arena, and when they come to a consensus, that's it.
Is there something particular about Pennsylvania, or are we going to see this? This is a grand jury report just out of Pennsylvania. It's 300 priests are saying, they say 1,000 young people, children, girls and boys, but probably thousands and thousands more, the Attorney General found.
I've been told, and it's being reported, that they have over 100 calls in 12 hours to the hotline since it's been released. This is an open investigation. It is continuing. I believe those numbers are very conservative.
And yet, where is Pope Francis on all of this? Pressure is growing. He hasn't responded. The church sex scandals continue to grow across the globe. I'm talking about sex abuse scandals. Earlier this week, former Australian Archbishop Philip Edward Wilson was sentenced to 12 months of house arrest. He's the most senior Catholic official in the world to be found guilty of concealing the sexual abuse of children. That was Australia. In late July, the former Archbishop of Washington, D.C., Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, became the highest-ranking Catholic leader in the United States to resign after he was accused of abusing a number of boys as young as 11 years old. Meanwhile, Tuesday, authorities in Chile raided the headquarters of the Catholic Church's Episcopal Conference as part of a widespread investigation into sex abuse. Former Father Bob, what is your response?
Well, just anecdotally, in 1994, when I was considering leaving the Irish Christian Brothers and going to be a priest, I asked the vocation director in the Newark Archdiocese, has Archbishop McCarrick stopped sleeping with the seminarians? It was known by everyone. And he assured me that he had, and that the papal nuncio and that another bishop had intervened and stopped it. But what we're talking about here is it's worldwide. It's not going to stop unless the outside agencies like the federal governments. 2 years ago, 32 organizations led by Road to Recovery and Catholic whistleblowers approached the Obama administration and pleaded for a national commission to investigate the Catholic Church's clergy sexual abuse problem. We didn't get anywhere, but we're still doing, these kinds of things. Australia, the Royal Commission was an absolute gem. It's going to be a seminal work in the history of child protection. We need to do the same thing in the United States.
And what do you expect? Do you think that the Vatican will respond, Sean?
I think eventually they're going to have to respond. In that, I think the politicians are going to have to respond. Let's keep in mind, this is a very damning report that was exposed. They were successful at redacting 30 names. Every diocese in Pennsylvania...
Of the priests.
Of the priests. Every diocese in Pennsylvania is exposed, right? So if you're a Pennsylvanian, listen to this, and you have young daughters or young boys, I can't tell you where in Pennsylvania those 30 people are right now. The only way we can do that is if we pass Mark Rozzi's legislation, because those 30 are going to argue before the Supreme Court. The Catholic Church and those 30 are going to be hidden unless the Supreme Court releases those names. So there's no telling where these 30 guys are operating in Pennsylvania.
You compare the treatment of these rapists and the cover-up of them to, the National Catholic Reporter 2010. A Catholic nun who is a member of a Phoenix Catholic Hospital's Ethics Committee was excommunicated and reassigned last week for a role in allowing an abortion to take place in a hospital. The surgery considered necessary to save the life of a critically ill patient. Do you compare it to that? And you think about the other stories that were told. For example, this was in the Pennsylvania Attorney General's report. Ex-priest Edward Ganster left the priesthood in 1990, moved to Orlando, Florida area, and went on to work at Disney World before he died in 2014. And how is that connected to the Catholic Church? He got a letter of recommendation from the Catholic Church.
Yeah, this is systemic. It's when Governor Frank Keating resigned as the chair of the first National Review Board that was set up after the Dallas Charter was passed in 2002, he resigned and said, This is exactly what the mafia is like. It's dealing with the mafia, and that's what we're dealing with. And we have to make sure that Catholics now take back their church and insist that these people are eliminated, fired. And that's what the Pope has to do. He has to have mass firings of bishops, and the leadership has to change. And that, of course, leads then to the structural changes that need to be made. Things like mandatory celibacy, which is absurd. And in 2018, the fact that we still have some of these traditions in place.
And what about nuns as priests?
Of course. Women have to have full participation in the church. If women were in leadership positions, this never would have happened.
For parents?
I'd like to go one step further. Not only leadership positions, power, position of power. If a woman that is celibate on level heading as a priest, a nun is not on level heading as a priest in the eyes of the church. But in the eyes of the church, if a nun feels, I'm not saying on the outside, within herself feels that she is on equal footing with this priest, there's nothing to prevent her from saying, hey, what's going on here? This is no more. Like they did to us. The nuns are excellent at it. Let me tell you, I grew up with nuns, and they're good at policing, but they only have so much power. You know, you can't police the priests if you have less power.
Well, we want to thank you both for being with us, for sharing your stories, for responding to this report, and, of course, we'll continue to cover this story. This is one state, Pennsylvania. Do you know of other states that are doing this kind of investigation?
Here. We're sitting in one of the worst.
New York.
Absolutely. And we have the most archaic laws here. We're equal to Mississippi and Alabama as far as our statutes of limitation in New York go. Plus, I will tell you, we have Times Square, St. Patrick's Cathedral, Niagara Falls. These guys work just like single guys. They bring them across state lines. Let's go to New York. I'll take you to St. Patrick's. I'll take you to a Broadway show. We'll go to Niagara Falls. And you'll be sexually abused, but it'll be okay. You'll have a great time. We'll get you a I Love New York hat, and we'll take you home to your family.
We need 49 more grand jury investigations is what we need.
In all the states. Sean Doherty, survivor of sexual abuse by a Pennsylvania priest, and former Catholic priest Bob Hotzen, president of Road to Recovery. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. When we come back, meet, who could be the first Muslim woman member of Congress. We're going to Detroit to speak with Rashida Tlaib. Stay with us.
Pretty women wonder where my secret lies. I'm not cute, built to suit a fashion model size. But when I start to tell them, they think I'm telling lies. Oh, it's in the reach of my arms, the span of my hips, the stride in my steps, the curl of my lips. I'm a woman, phenomenal woman. Oh, I'm a woman. Oh, baby, that's me. I walk into a room just as cool as you please. To a man, the fellas stare and they fall down on their knees.
Phenomenal Woman by Ruthie Foster. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to a congressional candidate in Michigan who's poised to become the first Palestinian-American woman and first Muslim woman to serve in Congress. Rashida Tlaib is a democratic socialist who supports the Palestinian right of return and a one-state solution. She also supports Medicare for all, a $15 minimum wage, and abolishing ICE. The child of immigrants, she's spoken out against the Trump administration's travel bans.
Last week, Rashida Tlaib won the Democratic primary for John Conyers' old House seat in Michigan. This is a part of her victory speech.
I will uplift you in so many ways, not only through service, but fighting back against every single oppressive, racist structure that needs to be dismantled, because you deserve better.
Rashida Tlaib is a former member of the Michigan House of Representatives. She is joining us now from Detroit. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. Rashida Tlaib, your response to your victory, which is extremely significant considering you are running unopposed, is that right, in the general election in November. What will be your first acts as a Congress member from Detroit, as the first Palestinian-American politician a woman in Congress, as well as the first Muslim woman to be elected?
I'm going to introduce the Justice for All Civil Rights Act. As many of you probably have heard, I mean, I've been talking about the fact that the 1964 Civil Rights Act hasn't been basically implemented as it was intended. Last 55 years, we've seen the courts very heavily stacked with conservative judges completely changed how we apply it, and saying that we can only show our civil rights was impacted or violated with intentional discrimination. And what I want to do is introduce a proposal that would change it back to saying that if you show that the impact in itself, that the impact of the policy may be redlining through the car insurance industry, may be not denying people of color the right to home ownership. Those are the kinds of things that I think we need to get back to. And again, the impact of a policy in itself, if it's discriminatory when it's implemented, when it's on the ground, then it should be considered a violation of our civil rights.
And Rashida, could you talk about how being a Palestinian American influenced your policies and the positions that you've taken?
You know, it's a combination, because I grew up in Detroit where 85% of my neighbors are African American, where many of my teachers through Detroit public schools were women of color who marched and was side by side with Martin Luther King. So many of them told me about where their family, grandparents and their parents couldn't buy homes in certain parts of the community. All of that, and combined with hearing the stories of my grandparents and my ancestors who talked about the fact that they couldn't leave, they were forced to leave their homes, or that they were discriminated against primarily because of their ethnicity. Again, I think that combination, all of that, hearing it at home and also experiencing it outside of my home through, friends and through mentors and teachers and everyone around me, I think that all of those things comes with me when I serve in Congress and represent and fight for the families of the 13 congressional districts.
Now, you certainly will be voting on issues related to Israel-Palestine. Can you talk about your views, the right of return, also what you think is the solution there? As
a child of Palestinian immigrants, again, every corner of my district is a reminder of the civil rights movement. And I bring that lens, and I try to, many of the Palestinians that have called me, reached out to me via social media, all I can say is I'm going to humanize this issue. And I'm not going to choose sides. And I'm not going to choose Netanyahu's Israel just like I'm not going to choose Trump's America. I am for everyone, every single person, Israeli, Palestinian, to have equal access to opportunities, to feel safe where they live, and to really be a genuine partner and a visionary around reaching peace in that region. And so I come with those stories of my grandfather and my uncle and my grandmother who still lives in the West Bank. Those are the kinds of stories I bring to try to humanize the issue, not trying to choose sides and these kinds of labels that people are already putting on me as if I have to be one for the other when I can't just be for humanity and for everyone that lives in Israel and Palestine. Every single one, I can tell you, the majority do not speak about this issue like the leadership there. They all really do want to live side by side. This kind of separate but equal, I've seen what it done in the history here in America, and it didn't work, and it still hasn't worked. I mean, even in continued segregation of our schools, which has increased with the privatization of our school system, all of these things, again, I come with that lens, and as well as a civil rights, human rights lawyer here in Detroit.
So do you advocate a one-state solution for Israel-Palestine?
I absolutely believe separate but equal doesn't work. That's something that I believe. But as an American, Amy, and you know this, I can't impose my own beliefs onto a whole people. I don't live there. I live here. But I can tell you, if it was something of possibility for a two-state solution, absolutely. Do I think it may work? That's my only opinion, is I don't know, because I've seen that, South versus North didn't work for us. And so I really just see this again through an American lens, that grew up in a predominantly African-American community, and looking at that history and understanding that those both one state and two state is a struggle. And for us to be able to try as Americans to finally just step back and allow people to determine that themselves, not to impose my own opinion onto a whole people. So know that I believe in those kinds of values of equality, and that equality and justice for someone shouldn't be based on their ethnicity, on their faith. And I think that is what drives me to say, of course, I prefer and lean towards one state, because I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful that the day that my grandfather told me the story of the Arab Jew that used to farm next to him, that it wasn't who was Palestinian Israeli. They both were Arab. They both were farming just like, and providing for their families. Again, I'm an optimist, and that's what I believe in, is one day to get back to that moment where my grandfather can look to his neighbor and not think that he's less than.
Well, Rashida, to go back to the policies that you have advocated here in the U.S., of course, you support Medicare for all, as we mentioned earlier. You were asked by the New York Times how you plan to fund that. And you pulled up the Department of Defense website and read aloud its daily announcements of new contracts, some for hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, you've also taken a very strong anti-war stance. So could you say how you intend to cut military spending, and whether you hope to find many Democratic allies in attempting to do so?
Absolutely, because we have to separate this idea of supporting our men and women in the armed forces. And I can tell you, this is about the military complex, Amy. I mean, this is just like I say, look at how we're funding education, which is now becoming an industry, a for-profit industry. And I don't want military, our health industry. I mean, look at what's happened, that every single thing from even our police has become a for-profit industry. These are private companies. I mean, yesterday, I think it was $44 million in contracts to for-profit companies, industries that are getting money to do work, with the Navy and the Army and so forth. And so when I pulled up the website, I wanted to prove a point that is this money that is really helping the American people, or is it helping companies? Because when we become a kind of company and corporation-driven government, from having our military and having our education system, even now our healthcare system is so much leaning towards very corporate-like and very for-profit. I think that's when the danger comes in. That's when we know those people are not for us. They're for the greed that comes with trying to privatize our whole military industry.
Rashida Tlaib, with the Israeli military killing, it's believed, over 140 Palestinians in the latest protests in Gaza, do you believe the U.S. should cut off military aid to Israel? I believe that we shouldn't be supporting any form of aid towards countries that are killing people that are innocent. And you can claim, as many will claim, that this is about security and so forth. But I think America needs to be held responsible. I mean, me as an American, I know and feel that when you see protesters, peaceful protesters marching, if it's in Gaza, all the way to even Africa and other parts of the world, I see it everywhere, that if it's promoting the violation of people's international human rights, if it's promoting the lack of freedom of speech and lack of freedom to assemble, which is our core, part of our core of who we are as Americans, then yes, cutting off aid is a possibility for me. Absolutely. I mean, we have to use our American aid and our partnership as leverage, Amy, to promote who we are. And we don't do that by supporting those kinds of killings. I just wanted to go to this amazing 2016 moment. It was right after the Democratic Convention, and Donald Trump spoke at the Detroit Economic Club. This is right after Khizr Khan had held up the Constitution and told a candidate Trump to read it. During Trump's speech, women in the audience repeatedly stood up to ask about a stance on sexual harassment in the workplace. One of the women was you, Rashida Tlaib. You got up and you shouted, "Have you ever read the U.S. Constitution?" We're playing right now the videotape of this moment. Do you need to read the Constitution? Let's go to a clip. We are watching right now, Rashida, you being taken out by security as you were standing there. Talk about what you were chanting in these last 30 seconds, what you were demanding of then-candidate Donald Trump. I was asking him, as he comes less than a mile away from where I live, is if he ever read the U.S. Constitution and what part of the U.S. Constitution does he believe in. I think it's so important that we really get back to who we are. And Trump's America is not who we are. And it was really my most American thing that I could ever have done is ask him a question that day, alongside with 12 other incredible women who also asked about labor rights, sexual harassment in the workplace. Could you see yourself doing the same thing again with you as a Congress member and him as president? I'm bringing my bullhorn to the floor of Congress, Amy. Well, we're going to do part 2 of this discussion, and we'll play that as well and post it at democracynow.org. We particularly want to ask you about what democratic socialism is. We've been speaking with Rashida Tlaib, who's poised to be the first Muslim woman elected to Congress. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.